Society. And I really don't know anything about Jeff's background and history. All I know is he's a super local historian, very interested in postcards and very interested in things like mills. My husband and I own a mill, so we have some interest in them also. And of course we have a whole lot of them along the Little Lehigh Creek. But Jeff's going to be talking about mills in general, not specifically in the Lehigh Valley. I'd like you to welcome him, and he will take questions after he's finished. So, okay. Here's Jeff.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I had a bio written up, but I can't find it, so I might as well just tell you. I've been a member of the Society for the Preservation of Old Mills since about 1994. I was interested in mills prior to that. There were certain connections through postcards that were made, and I'll give you the details of that during my presentation. Also in 2004, I went to a meeting in Union Mills, Maryland, to help start the Mid-Atlantic chapter of Spoon, which covers Pennsylvania, Maryland, Virginia's. New Jersey is covered at northeast, so that's not included in Mid-Atlantic. What I'm going to show you is pretty much broken down there, but there's a lot of little intricate pieces in between. This is going to take about an hour, and then we have the possibility of putting in some scenes that Anne created to show you more local area mills. But this is like a world history. It starts in the world, and then I bring it to America and keep it as Americana. And there's some scenes that I keep seeing that I really concentrated on. The PowerPoint I made that about 3 years ago. Prior to that, I was doing displays in handheld and overhead projector, and it just got kind of messy. So this cleans it up, it puts it all in front of you, and those Americana scenes, more and more I started to see beyond the grist mills, names attached to the mills that are famous in America. And it seems like more and more, Spoon, not in particular, but the old mill people that visit mills seem to gravitate towards those things that are known as Americana. Famous people are associated with the mills. Unfortunately, that sort of gets rid of the history, because you've got agriculture and the farmers and all that contributed to making that mill work. But you're going to see a little bit of a transition that I put together about Americana, and sometimes why a mill is famous. But it wasn't milling. It was famous because of somebody, which is almost unfortunate, but that's sort of a trend. It's a way to celebrate things through people rather than the mill itself. That's included in there. So the more I talk, the longer it's going to take, so we'll just get going. I'll just sit down, use the pointer, and we got an electronic advancer. Hopefully all that works well, so we're all set to go. Of course, you see the first scene there. Okay, we can head to the second scene. Of course, some of you would ask that question. Grist is the grains and seeds of a grass plant, which we would use to produce flour, feed, and meal. There's a lot more things I could say as it comes up. I'll let you read if there's something that's really... There's more script than I mentioned. If you want to go back, we can do that. But, of course, rather lesser-known grains that are in a mill are at the bottom there. That there are mills that produce that, but not necessarily a grist mill. Next. Okay. Could that be the first type of grist mill? Someone pounding on a rock? Well, in history, yes. And if you're worried about nudity, that's about as bad as it gets. So we'll advance. Next. Okay. Early hand mills. We have things that you would call a saddle stone. Of course, you know what a mortar and pestle is. Just different ways that early grain would be ground. You probably sit with your legs beside that stone, or at the bottom there, that's known as the mano and metate. In some impoverished lands, that's still used today. They do not have any modern conveniences, and those tools you might even see yet. Next, a little bit of advance in technology. Horns. You pour the grain in the top hole and you give it a rotation, whether it's stone or granite or whatever. That seen to the left is from a museum in France. You're looking at tree trunks that have metal embedded in between that would give you the surface of the millstone. Next. Early buildings. Eventually things got modernized enough and there was enough of a farming community that you wanted to enclose your millstones, and so you built some type of structure. Now those two scenes are exploded views. They would be completely sealed up, you wouldn't be able to see, but for just demonstrating, you're seeing an open view. To the left you see like a paddle wheel, and water hits that directly turns the top millstone through an axle. And again, on the right, very similar. You're almost looking at Greek and Roman technology. There was a time when Greek and Roman were sort of separate, but when the Roman Empire took over, everything seemed to be called Roman. But you see some little bit different view there. But again, you've got a direct axle turning the millstone on the top. Next. A more modern view from Portugal. It's similar to what I had shown in the past. You've got a little laid down wheel with little flutes on it, like spoons, that catches the water and it rotates that. And again, a direct drive right to the top millstone. Next. Somewhere along the way, someone advanced the technology, and that's attributed to Marcus Vitruvius Pollio, a Roman author and engineer. He decided that there's a better way. You had to transmit the power horizontally from the water wheel, so he devised the undershot water wheel, where the water would go under the water wheel, and then you needed a gearing system to transmit that power vertically. So it looks kind of primitive, and as you would expect in 25 BC it was, but you needed some type of gearing system to transmit that power vertically. And what you're looking at is Roman-style millstones. They were popular in the Roman era, but as time progressed, they turned out to be less efficient. The grain was sort of dropped vertically and with gravity rather than being ground with the millstone. It's the Roman idea, but it didn't last very long. Next. Again, you're looking at a Roman era. Pompeii was unearthed about 200 or so years ago through time. They excavated it and they found what was an old mill combined with a bakery. The scene to the left is what you probably would see today at Pompeii, and to the right is an artist's conception of what might have gone on there. And again, you're looking at Roman style millstones, they're conical. And of course the Romans depended on slave labor at that time, so you're probably looking at that action going on there. And the bakery right next door, you milled the grain, likely wheat, and went right to the bakery, and it serviced the people. Outside you see a woman. There's a possibility that this could be either a merchant mill, which they're selling their grain, or a custom mill, which they're using the grain and then giving some back to, or milling the grain and giving the flour back to the farmer. Either way, whether it's a custom mill or merchant mill, that's what things look like in Pompeii. Next. Somewhere along the way, we had to develop a overshot water wheel. It is much more efficient than an undershot. You use more water and the weight of the water, but an overshot wheel would be necessary only in hilly areas. If you had flat land, you had to get the water up a certain amount of feet, and if the land didn't allow that, you could not use an overshot water wheel. Now this scene is actually a trip hammer in a forge, which would likely be Austria, German area in Europe, where they had a hillier region, rather than the lowland where you'd need an undershot wheel. Next. Some ways that you would sift flour to create more white grade flour, because flour that comes from a millstone is whole wheat. It has everything ground in. You don't separate it. Normally, you just use the flour to bake your bread and whatever, but as time goes on, people thought white was better, white was superior, so they wanted a white-looking flour rather than the grayish beige color that you get from a whole wheat flour. So sifters were developed. That's seen to the left, of course. If it's primitive, you don't have plastic at all 2,000 years ago. So your options would be wool, horsehair, or linen, which came from the flax plant. Romans were known to brew 7 different grades of flour. A few hundred years ago, you would look at the right. It's a sifter with a screening stretched on that decline there. You'd shake it back and forth and it would go down into the bins. You'd collect the back part where the bin is missing, unfortunately. You'd get your finer grade of flour falling out first. Middle grade, and then down at the end you get your coarser grade flour along, it's mixed up with the bran and germ. Next, as technology improved, you were looking at a 1730 initially invention, the bolter, which you would introduce the flour through a chute. It would come inside that grid in there, it would churn, rotary, and you get your grades of flour dropping out the bottom. Now this is just on display at a mill just for demonstration purposes. Not all the chutes and things are connected here, and you can see at the end it was automated for a pulley system. After 1730, different versions. It initially would have been hand cranked, but then as automation came along, you had an automatically turning machine. Next. Another possibility was called flogging. You'd shake and beat a bag and hopefully fine flour would come through the weave. Rather primitive, probably not used at all today, but it was another way to get the finest grade of flour that you could. Like I said, people wanted white flour, but they did not know they were getting rid of all the nutrients. Next. The interior, as gristmills progressed, you got your almost a standard view. They're standard equipment. They might be a little bit different looking in some, but they're all pretty much called the same. Over top of the millstone you had a plaster of Paris cover that not only added stability but weight, and if it happened to be out of balance you could grind away some of that plaster of Paris and put in lead or whatever you'd need to balance out the millstone. At the bottom, the common components were called, the runner stone was at the top, the bed stone was at the bottom. You had a spindle that ran off the power, that axle would turn the top stone. The eye of the stone in the middle is where the grain would pour. And again, a standard look at the top right there, you got your typical millstone, what they called furniture. That would surround everything, and it was the heart of the mill, beyond the water wheel. Every mill had a Hurst frame. That's what held up the gearing system and the millstones, because if that was connected to the mill while it was rotating and in operation, that constant vibration shaking would shake the mill itself and possibly crack the foundation. You did not want that vibration connected to the mill itself. That Hurst frame was an independent structure that would hold the vibration away from the mill structure. Next. Again, it's very similar looking. A lot of mills, you got the same type of furniture, maybe a little bit different design. The spout brought the grain to the hopper. The hopper was then open to the shoe. The horse itself is a four-legged, most of them are four-legged. Occasionally you'd see a 3 or a 6, but that stand would hold the hopper in place so the grain could fall down. The damsel was connected to the main power shaft. They would shake the shoe, which would drop the grain into the millstones. Now there's different names for the actual cover. Some call it the case, or the vat, or the tun. There's many different names, I guess, depending on what language, whether it's German, English, or whatever they called it, they would call that in America. The curb would hold the case firm to the floor, so the flour wouldn't escape. You could either channel it somewhere where it could be moved through an elevator system, or as the man on the left is doing, he's taking that fine, he happens to be doing cornmeal, But he's bagging it right there in that bagging trough. It's not going anywhere. It comes right out of the millstones and into a bag for sale. Next. Well, I forgot the stone crane on the end. If you want to pick up the millstones, you needed a crane because some of the millstones were about a ton apiece. Now here's some scenery. It happened to be a triple postcard thing in my collection. And it was just absolutely beautiful. Long forgotten. If you go there today, you'd see nothing. That archway over the creek and bridge is still there, but otherwise you're in a forest. And if I wouldn't have asked locally where this was, I wouldn't have found it. Someone told me, oh, the falls is down there beyond them woods, and I found it. I should introduce a local or a modern scene at the bottom there, but I just hadn't added it in. But that mill, long gone. What you're seeing at the top is this structure. You're looking at the bottom structure over here, and this main was up on the hill. To walk there today, you'd see some stones and a little bit of chunks of concrete from a footer, but otherwise everything is gone. And then again, you see your same type of millstone apparatus inside there. Same type of operation, same little ornate with a little bit of lathe work on them, on the horse there, but a typical inside of a mill. Next. French burr quartz is the main millstone make of the main way you make millstones from pieces. The quartz was mined, like it says, in veins 12 inches thick, and you could not get a whole millstone. It was not like an open quarry like you'd find granite in this area. The French quartz were small pieces. They bring them over in ballast in boats and put them together and band them. 4 millstones, once they got to either of the ports of either Philadelphia, Boston, New York, wherever the Europeans would bring them across the Atlantic. Next. Typical look, the jigsaw look that was put together, and that's because you could not have a one-piece French burr. If you see one piece, it was probably local quartz or granite or whatever they could find in a local quarry. Next. This is an up-close view. Actually, I took this picture in the trunk of my car. I cleaned up a millstone that was broken over in Whitehall at the Helper Springs mill. It was dumped upside down and left in the earth. I turned it around, and we're gonna reassemble it as a footstep at the miller's house. But you can see the striations that were made by someone dressing that stone and giving it little grooves that would help grind the grain. And the little pits are natural to French burr quartz. They are like Swiss cheese, and as that wears, it actually adds sharpness to the stone. Now the striations that were added by the millstone dresser, you can advance one. You can see that. Advance. Next. Jay, I got it. You can see he's adding those dressing areas. You got high and low areas that would help grind the grain. Next, another scene of the millstone tools that you would use in different circumstances, either the low parts or the high part striations. So mill bill, mill pick, different names. If you needed to kneel down on something from whatever language it came from, the pillow is called a bist, and that's what you'd rest your knees or elbows on as you're doing this job, which would take many hours. And if you had to do the top stone and the bottom stone, you would do them opposite. As they rotate, there would be an opposite action. One would turn, the striations would point one direction on the bottom stone, and the top stone would have the striations in a different direction. You'd get a crisscross action that would help grind the grain. Next. Someone to introduce is Oliver Evans. He was born near Wilmington, Delaware. In 1787, he had some incredible ideas that he employed at his family mill. And he went on to patent these ideas in 1790, which would have been the U.S. patent number 3 under the U.S. government, which only began in 1790. What he introduced was something called the grain elevator, the horizontal auger, the hopper boy, the ascender, descender, and the automatic winch. Now the ascender and descender pretty much went away. You had the augers and the elevators, but it wasn't very popular moving great quantities high and low. You would use the grain elevator. And he's very well known. He had 80 patents in his life. Next. Okay, we get into some reading here. Of course, when Oliver Evans tried to profit from his inventions, prior to 1790 in the colonies, he did not get much patent protection. There's a few states that offered protection, but it really didn't kick in until 1790, when our United States government began. It was authorized by President Washington, and the man that wrote it and took care of it was Thomas Jefferson. And Jefferson himself is known for his creative inventiveness and did not seek patents to protect himself. So what happened when Evans wanted an extension, Jefferson said, no, we don't want to do that. Thomas Jefferson was reminded that he has a mill in Charlottesville, Virginia that was upgraded by the Oliver Evans inventions, and that he greatly profited from that. So Jefferson said, okay, we will offer patent law extensions. And written in the law, if you go back to 1805, it says, for the benefit of Oliver Evans, the beginning of the 14-year extension to patents. Written for Oliver Evans, allowed by Thomas Jefferson. If you want to keep on reading, fine. If not, we'll go to the next. Next. This is a drawing by Oliver Evans around 1789. He later wrote a book in 1790 that's still looked at today. If you want to look how to take an old mill and restore it back to this era, you almost have to look at what Oliver Evans created. The reason the ship is next to the mill is because Oliver Evans, his main factory was in Philadelphia, coming up from Wilmington, and he was very familiar with the shipping docks. So he created that, what I called before, the ascender and descender to unload ships, which then it really wasn't used in the mills themselves. The other apparatuses were. Next. And this is an easier to understand. You'd have your grain coming in, it would go up an elevator, it would get cleaned, it would come down into a garner, which would be in a holding bin, come down to the millstones, and again, as it got around, it would come up and get cleaned. The hopper boy is a flour cooler. Prior to this, they would dump the ground flour onto the floor in a bin, and a boy would scrape it across the floor with a broom. So they kept the name Hopper Boy, and now it was kept that name, and it's automated with a broom to churn the flour before it goes into the sifting mechanism, which is the bolter, which I had shown before. This shows different grades. As it goes downhill, you get your different grades falling out by gravity. The Hopper Boy sort of went away in history because other inventions came along to improve that. You know, cooling fans and such. It eliminated the hopper boy. There's still some mills. I know there's one in Washington, D.C. that has an original hopper boy in. You can see it operating. It's very rare because they went away quite quickly when technology took over. Next. Again, we'll look at Oliver Evans specifying what you need as far as a water wheel goes. In his book, he shows a lot of this, but it was up to the millwright. They had to build the mill and build the dam to understand all this. Again, an overshot wheel depended on, you've got to have 6-8 foot of water head coming off the land behind the dam to utilize that power. If you didn't have that high a water flow, you would have to use a smaller water wheel. Now what we have is we call a breast shot, which hits the fullest part of the wheel, right at halfway. Now, you didn't just put it to the water wheel, you had to have an apron that held the water. Otherwise, it would just spill out and you'd have wasted power. Again, pitchback. You had an apron that held the water and helped keep the water against the wheel. For the undershot, you didn't need any kind of apron or anything. It just you had the flow of the water moving the water wheel. It was like the less sophisticated of all of them, but it was the less powerful. Next. What you're looking at is a wheat kernel. I mean, what you wanted to do beyond millstones, if you wanted to sift it, you had to sift away the germ and the bran, which we all know has all the nutrients. The 83% of the white flour is called the endosperm, and that's pretty much, there's no nutrients, there's not much there as far as anything that you need. You wanted the bran and the germ to have a little bit of food quality with it. So as we go on in technology, they realized that things were going wrong, and they tried to catch up. Next. Okay, we're getting a little bit of documentation here. At one time, eastern Pennsylvania around Philadelphia, the word Pennsylvania and Philadelphia didn't exist. It was called New Sweden, because the Swedish were the first to settle there. They were colonized immigrants from Finland, Netherlands, Norway, and Germany. Things happened. It eventually went to the Netherlands' control as of 1655, and Governor Johan Prince was turned away. Eventually, a man named William Penn was told, well, his father has land over here in America, and King Charles was going to give it to him. He wanted to call it Sylvania. William Penn wanted to call it New Wales, so they sort of compromised, and it was called Penn's Woods, which we call Pennsylvania today. Next. And at the site at Cobb's Creek still exists. There was a historical marker, but someone stole it or ran into it. I don't know if it's been replaced. The most prominent thing there, I think it was called the Bluebell Inn. It's virtually on the same property. It's still there today, but I'd like to visit it. I just haven't got there yet. William Penn comes along as of 1682. He asked his friend Caleb Pusey to build a mill, have it available to service the settlers or export some to England. And that seemed to be a good business. Caleb Pusey did that. The initial mill was destroyed in flood, and he had to keep on rebuilding. It does not exist today. I don't know the exact history. Again, that's a place in Delaware County I'd like to visit. The Caleb Pusey House is the oldest standing structure known that William Penn set foot in. It still exists today. Anything else that William Penn owned or whatever has either been a recreation or does not exist anymore. Next. Here we're looking at what I call pre-Oliver Evans mills. It does not have the height and the room for the technology that later advanced. We're looking at eras of 1640, 1654, 1661, 1664. And you notice all these are up, well, 3 of them are in Massachusetts, the ones in Union Mills, Maryland. Those are fairly modern scenes, except for Sandwich, Massachusetts. The miller's house, or the granary or whatever to the right, was torn away and does not exist. But they have recreated this. It is still a park up in Sandwich, Massachusetts. It's still a mill today, but completely rebuilt, and that structure was gone. Next. More to read. The high point they consider is around 1840. That's when you had the most mills running on older technology before you had the loss of what we call the grain belt and the breadbasket on the East Coast. It went west. And as of 1860, a lot of the newer mills were in the Midwest. And that's because they imported grain from the Ukraine, Western or Eastern Europe, Western Russia. And that was because the railroad was coming through. The railroad would bring in the immigrants with their grain, allow them land along the railroad to grow wheat, and that's why we have superior wheat in the Midwest versus the East Coast. It really came through with the railroad. And another reason that you had some westward movement from the East Coast was, of course, the railroad itself from the East Coast going west, and the Erie Canal. That allowed things to go west and east, and another trade route. Roller mill technology came along, but we haven't really got to that yet. You'll see that, but roller mills were born pretty much in the Midwest, and that top technology really took over. Next. Another look at early mills. Now here you see a larger structure. This is possibly the evidence that Oliver Evans machinery is being used, because you got your stacked doors in the front. You had a power winch that would bring things to the top floor. Prior to this, you had stairways that the miller would have to carry the bags of grain up and down the steps, and the bags of flour as it's being processed. 1794 and onward. But at the top view, it's kind of deceiving. If you've ever been there, East Berlin is actually in Adams County. The picture's standing in Adams County, but the creek separates Adams County and York County. So the mill is in York County, but the town is in Adams County. I think I said that right. All these are still standing, and I'm trying to help the miller at the Hawk Mill at the bottom left get rid of some of his equipment. He bought that property about 20 years ago, and he inherited the mill. It's used for storage. He'd like to see all the equipment removed and utilized by other mills. He would like to tear that down and build a garage. He has no use for the mill. He realizes there's some historical significance there as far as the equipment, and would like to see it utilized. I'm trying to help. We got a number of mills standing in line. What's free tends to be expensive, because the 4 roller mills are going to cost $5,000 to $10,000 to get out through rigging and trucking and things that have to be done. You don't just pick them up and move them. And we've been trying since August, which we were going to get it done, and it hasn't been done. But we're trying. So these are all more recent mills that all still exist today. Next. Not operational, but they exist. And again, a little bit larger. We're coming into beyond the Oliver Evans influence. Up in Still Valley, we're in New Jersey, near Alpha. If you ever come across Route 78 into New Jersey, there's a railroad trestle that crosses 78. That railroad trestle is on a hill, and it crosses 78 about a half mile away behind here. This is near Alpha, New Jersey. Helfrich Springs Mill in Whitehall, very well documented. And of course, we have the Cooper Mill in Chester. It's among one of the more operational. You can see a very good demonstration of mill technology there. And of course, we all know Craig and Ann's mill. I took all the other pictures, but that I couldn't get a good picture. Mine wasn't any good, so I borrowed that off the internet through millpictures.com. It looks bright and nice, so it serves it well. Other than that, a lot of the scenes you're going to see, either I took the photos or they're postcards, but I'll give credit where credit is due. Next. You can see, go back a quick. You can see when we had some changes here. Something happened. We had initially a brick structure, or a stone structure. Bricks were added, either it burnt down, rebuilt, or they had to expand for newer technology. But something happened here, I don't know what, and I've been watching that millstone since about 1995, and it's virtually gone now. Once you got rain hitting a millstone that's sitting outside, especially the French bird, it's held together with iron bands, it just deteriorates. And this mill is in such a location of flooding. It's been for sale for as long as I can remember, and I believe it's still for sale today. It's very sad that it's in a location that's sort of desolate and flood prone. Next. Here we have some scenes from Lehigh County, one of the more historic that dates back to 1770. Now these two pictures are not mine, they were from Elmer Stahl. And that name, his daughter is Gloria Woodland, who wrote a book on mills within the last 10 years or so in memory of her father. She didn't know what to do with some of his archives that she feared would get thrown away, so she gave them to me. And I'm very thankful that a lot of his items were photos, so he took this picture probably around 1980, I'm guessing, because it was torn down around 1986, I heard. Logged, you can see it's deteriorating. This is Bausch Road. This is the Bausch Betts Mill near Linville. I think that's, you're near Low Hill Township or Weisenberg Township at this time. I'm not sure you're into Lynn Township, but this Bausch Betts Road goes between Linville and the little town that no longer exists, Switzer. There's a Switzer Creek that heads towards Worley's Corners. This is the Veracruz Mill, better known as the E.B. Fry. It's just outside Emmaus. You don't get to see that scene anymore. It's tree covered along the roadway. It's hidden. This is probably standing on Veracruz Road looking at that mill, but it's been modernized. It's in beautiful shape. There's been newspaper articles, the Morning Call, whatever, have wrote about this. This structure went in the 90s. I lived within a mile in Emmaus of this. But at that time, I really was not interested in mills much. But you know, things certainly changed. And I heard the water wheel's still in there. They have it. It's a living quarters, but the water wheel's sectioned off. It's still there. Top view is the Shantz Mill. And Craig, you were with me when I took this picture. We got a grand tour, and I took that picture that afternoon. We went touring the Lehigh County Mills. Arlen Shantz owns that. I think it's known as the Evergreen Farm. He has evidence of a sawmill down along the bottom. The water no longer flows. It was known as a linseed oil mill and converted to a grist mill today, and at that time he just used it as storage. Wineport Pike is right along the back, and it ends at Hosensack about a half-mile away. Lehigh County's oldest known site. This would have been near Center Valley, near Coopersburg. Everything you see no longer exists. The Route 309 expansion around 1970-71 tore everything away. This upper intersection, you can imagine, is 378 coming from Bethlehem. The old 378 still exists as northbound lanes, but the southbound lanes were cut through the hillside, come through here, and there might be a grass median that separates an on-ramp from Route 309 where this mill stood, but otherwise the southbound lanes of Route 309 cuts right through here. It's probably better known 50 years ago as the Mod Mill, still celebrated by Jerry Dean, who is a known DJ, and he still has some reminiscing and little gatherings to remember that mill and what he put on there. Eddie Sachs, the race driver, had owned it. It had been owned by his grandmother. Prior to that, I got first-hand information when Eddie Sachs showed up at Coopersburg and donated a racing trophy to the Coopersburg Historical Society. I talked to him and his family, and they said, you know, it was a wonderful time back then. Unfortunately, Eddie Sachs was killed at Indianapolis in 1964. Next. The oldest known site in Northampton County, Shimersville, which no longer exists. The entire town was bought up by Bethlehem Steel. This is the other side of the river from Freemansburg. There's nothing in existence of Shimerville today. The exact site of the mill is one of the ponds of the Bethlehem sewage treatment plant. There's nothing there. What you see here is one of those 1976 commemorative plates that a lot of townships put out in 1976. They're showing what we'd assume would be the Nathaniel Irish Mill. And again, this bottom portion. But known in history, Jacob Shimer built a new mill around 1816. And this is it. Chances are what Nathaniel Irish had in 1737 was log. It did not look like this. No one knows what it looked like, so you sort of represent it by looking at what existed in history. Chances are this is not what that mill looked like. But we do know, next picture, that, we'll get to it. That's okay, next. This is Shimersville. There's nothing there. We have a modern bridge over the Saucon Creek, which empties into the Lehigh River. Bethlehem Steel owns land and other industries along here. But it was all wiped out around 1935. This is the mill with the upper portion. This is the colorized postcard. Whether or not the colors are accurate, we don't know. Next. I was fortunate to find these online. This is a 1902 view. Again, 1935, everything was torn away. A friend of mine is a historian, Frank Fabian, over near Hellertown. He was raised on this property. When he was born, a few years after the mill was torn down, he remembers the fence, and the property was told not to go over the fence. That's, as a little boy, that was his boundary. But he does not remember the mill. It was torn down before he was born. I told him about these pictures. He says, oh yeah. He says, they're my pictures. I said, oh. He says, but I didn't authorize them going online. Someone copied them, and that's where they ended up. He says, that's how it goes. He says, it's now a historical record, and it always will be because it's online. But he said, yes, those are his pictures. So that was, that's how it goes. He said someone donated to him as part of either Hellertown Historical or Lower Saucon, Northampton County, a box of old negatives from the town. And these pictures were made from those negatives. So imagine how valuable you find in an old box that was going to get thrown out. And he's very, very glad that a lot of these scenes exist. Next. Now we'll go to Bucks County. This might not be the oldest in Bucks County, but probably the most prosperous and long-lasting. What you're looking at is the James Savage Mill. Now I would assume early in 1795 it was only a small portion of this. He must have had a prosperous business because it was added on. Along comes Mr. Benfield, and it's added on again. We assume this structure, the book sort of creased, and you don't get to see the complete structure here. But you see, again, a prosperous business, it added on, and looks like it added on again, with grain silos and whatever. Apparently it closed around 1985, it looks pretty much like this today as apartments. And I actually have a postcard. This is a postcard. It actually ended up, they found another view. The Bucks County area Arcadia book has that on its cover, but they don't have my copy. If you next, you can enlarge that. Next view. It says, my friend William, that corn cloverleaf dairy feed is here at my mill. Would you be glad? I would be glad if you would fetch your load. James Savage. A message from the miller to a customer. And there's a history lesson again. I couldn't figure out why it says Benjamin. Benjamin was what was South Percy. It was known as the little town of Benjamin before Percy expanded and included South Percy. So South Percy is a borough. Half of it was known as Benjamin. And this is a 1915 postcard. Next. Here we come into Berks County. We're going to give a little tour of what's standing today. Niantic is across from Route 100 from the town of Bally. 1876, it was known as the Centennial Mill. Now, I stood in Berks County to take the picture, but the mill across County Line Road is actually in Montgomery County. And what you have is the original mill, 1876, and he added on. Now this looks really weathered because he used sheet metal siding, and it's very badly rusted. So you're not looking at stone, you're looking at a wood frame structure with sheet metal siding. This is still much available to see today, right off Route 100 from Hereford. You can see it within 100 foot off Route 100. It's cleaned up a bit. After an auction, they removed the millstones. I believe it's a residence or a studio today. Looks pretty much like that. There's a barn that's given that shadow, still there today. Nearby, across Route 100, out in the woods, you got your little town of Chapel, which is sort of overshadowed by Hereford. This mill is that mill. This is an older version, 1905 era, but it dates back to 1825. This is the same mill, just stucco. That's the same house with an extension. Another window, they expanded the house. This road is now a cul-de-sac. It's called Fetterman's Road, so I call it Fetterman's Mill. That's one of the names of the millers, but it went through a progression of owners. But I call it Fetterman's Mill because it's Fetterman's Road. There was a bridge down here towards Chapel that's been torn away and it might never be rebuilt. Chapel Road will go to Palm and on to East Greenville in the background in Montgomery County. It said I have Berks as some reference, but this is certainly Montgomery County. Yeah, this is now a cul-de-sac. Next. As I had said, the success of the Erie Canal and the railroads, you moved your operation west, or you had your immigrants moving west. What you're looking at is the Pillsbury A Mill, built around 1881, and that's the same structure. Over here. This is the same structure, which shows a progression of enlargement. As much grain that you grind, you have to have storage for that grain previous to that, and then after it you have to have storage for the flour if you don't ship it right away. And notice they're shipping a railroad cars, not horse and buggy. So they're grinding, I can assume, more in a week than an old country mill can grind in a year. It's just that much of a huge operation. Roller mills came into place, and we'll get to that. Now this is your Washburn and Crosby. It says Washburn at the time, his partner was Crosby eventually. Again, shipping and railroad cars. And we're looking at Minneapolis, Minnesota. Their earlier mill exploded in 1878, and this was built as of 1880. Washburn and Crosby were the first known to use roller mills, high output flour machines. And it just exploded from there. Not exploded, that's the wrong word, but the flour industry just took off everywhere. Next. Here we're going to touch on water turbines. They were developed in France around the 1820s, perfected in the U.S. In the 1840s, we had the beginnings of the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts. You might have heard that location. It was very well known for textiles. They installed turbines, they installed waterways and canals up there that had been just waterways for water wheels, and that led to the expansion of the turbine industry. Now they were expanded upon, improved upon. Here you have some three choices. You either encased it in a steel metal tub, brought water to it. You could build a wooden cribbing, which was very evident in the Helford Springs Mill in Whitehall. It's completely gone now. But this concrete structure, poured concrete, you can see today in the Wagner Mill, Wagner-Heller Mill, in Hellertown Historical Society's mill. Also in the base underneath the Haynes Mill, you'd see a poured wooden bay that would hold the water for the turbine. Again, the turbine was not powered by the flow of the water unless you opened it up and let the force of the water's weight force through. And the next scene you'll see that. Next, what you had, your enclosed turbine, but what you had is a sideways water wheel, almost looking back to the earliest technology of the water wheel. You had a sideways runner, they called it, and that's where the pressurized water would flow. It would flow through the vanes on the outside of the turbine. You can move this regulating gate to close the water and open the water. One of these shafts would go to up, and the miller would turn the shaft and open the regulator and allow the water to flow. Much more efficient, virtually zero waste of water, and a lot more power would come out of this. Comparing, very surprisingly, the turbines at the Hellertown Historical Society are quite large. They're 4 or 5 feet across, and they got two of them. A larger structure is the Haynes Mill near Dorney Park. That has a turbine you can almost put your hands around. And that powered everything when they weren't running the engine that they promised to run so they wouldn't drain water from Dorney Park. But incredible different power ranges of the turbine. Next. This is a scene from Pennsylvania. You've got your pressurized water coming down into the mill, and it almost looks comical. It's beautiful, real photo postcard that you can see all the detail of the water shooting out when the mill's closed off. If you'd open the turbine, you'd have a smooth flow, you'd get less waste. It's going right down into the river or the creek, which would be Buttermilk Falls. The Susquehanna River is nearby. This is way out in the sticks. The closest place is the Clark Summit up near Wyoming County. I believe Clark Summit is outside, that's in Lackawanna County. But I arrived here in 1995. There was a bulldozer on the property, and the neighbor said, "Well, you just missed it." The summer before, they tore it all away, and he told me to look across the way, and there was a man out cutting his grass. He says, "You see that man?" He says, "That's the local historian. You want to have to talk to him." I walked across. There's a bridge that someone probably stood on. Next scene, I don't know if I kept the next scene or not no, I didn't. But I talked to the local historian. He talked about that mill. I showed him the postcard, and he said, "Oh, that's wonderful." He said, "You missed it by a year." I talked about the Haynes Mill, and here we have it. Open during the summer through the Lehigh County Historical Society, about 1 to 4 every Saturday and Sunday, approximately April to October. There's a long history of it. Mainly what you see today was rebuilt in 1909 because it was destroyed by fire in 1908. And they attributed that fire by spontaneous combustion. You hear that, but they say, "Oh yes, you store the grain long enough and you don't process it soon enough, you get heat." Almost like seeing a pile of hay outside and you see steam coming off of it. Well, you enclose it long enough, you generate heat, and it did spontaneously combust. Soon after Mr. Haynes took over, so he had a lot of rebuilding to do. So, if you don't know the story, that mill might not be today if Lehigh County would not have swapped land with Dorney Park. Today, Dorney Park expanded up the hill, well, 20 years ago, towards 222. That was Lehigh County's property. Dorney Park owned the valley. It's a floodplain. That big pond was the mill pond that the showboat would go through, and it would be a backdrop to Castle Garden. That was the Haynes Mill pond. But it also creates a floodplain for the Cedar Creek. So Dorney Park swapped land with Lehigh County to expand the park, and they sure did. And what we have now is a protected parkland with the mill that's owned by Lehigh County. And that mainly began around 1981, that the Lehigh County Parks observed that as a museum. And Wilbert Haynes helped create that museum with the signage and interpretation that went along with it. So that's what we have today. Next. This is an interior view of the Haynes Mill. They have roller mills. That millstone era is long gone, and that you're looking at 1909 technology. You've got your grain coming in from the holding bins. It's processed, and they say you'd have to go through here twice. You grind your wheat. If you wanted very, very fine flour, you'd go sift it out, bring it to a second roller. Sift it out, bring it to a third. Again, you'd sift between each rollings. And then if you wanted again fine flour, you'd bring it through again. So someone had to know where all this happened. It's incredible. I encourage you to take a tour through there. They do show this. I've heard they don't run the turbine anymore to have the gears moving through. They just don't want the liability of anything breaking. As far as the Lehigh County Historical Society goes, they sort of limit it. But Kenny Haynes is the son of the last manager. He's the nephew of Wilbur Haynes. He oversees the property for the Lehigh County Parks. If you want a very personal tour, let me know, because Kenny Haynes will be glad to show you what goes on in there. And whereas Lehigh County Historical shows you a couple floors, Kenny Haynes will allow a bit more of a showing by permission of Lehigh County Parks.
Ken Haynes is in the audience over here.
Oh, very good. Hi, Ken.
How you doing?
Am I okay with that, Ken? Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
Very good.
Right on.
Yep, he lives right across the alley, and that's his playground. Very good. Next. We'll get to roller mills. Now that we covered the transition from millstones or water wheels to turbines, now we go from roller mills to, well, from millstones. They had been in existence early in the 1600s, known for grinding sugar cane, but that technology was expanded on. Bakeries would roll grind grain. It was just an experiment. It's something they did. It really didn't catch on until 1830s. Someone, a Swiss engineer, perfected the idea through metal rollers, and at times they experimented with porcelain rollers. 1843, you had technology borrowed from the railroad. There was hard casting of iron, which maybe not would be as good as steel, but it gave you a superior iron. It was good enough for railroad wheels, so it was good enough for roller mills. 1876, they were introduced to the world through a Paris International Exposition, and that really caught on. 1870 era, you got Washburn and Crosby, which I did not mention. They were the originators of gold medal flour because they did win medals for their roller mill flour. And that eventually became General Mills. Washburn and Crosby went away and combined other mill businesses, and that is General Mills today. Next. Some scenes of roller mills. The earlier technology had gears running them. Now why that went away, but they found that using the canvas pulleys, well back then it would be leather pulleys, was a superior way of controlling the rollers. Now this is an earlier version of a roller mill. This is a patent idea by John Stevens with the gearing mechanism, but technology moved on. Next. Fairly modern open view of a roller mill. What you're seeing is rollers. One would turn one direction, one would turn the other. You didn't pulverize it completely. You wanted to crack open the wheat seed. As I said, in the Haynes mill, it might have gone through 8 times. So initially you're cracking open the wheat, sifting out a little, cracking it some more, till you eventually get rid of the bran and germ. Now remember I said, you don't want to do that, but it's almost impossible to process with the roller mill without getting rid of that. That's the nature of what the roller mill does. It gradually reduces the grain, and it will break away the bran and the germ. Next. More scenes of roller mills. Now picture this. Unknown, but maybe this is Washburn and Crosby or Pillsbury. And this reveals another problem with that earlier advancement in technology. They're covered with flour. Now in a coal mine you got black lung. In a flour mill you got white lung. It's just as devastating. It leads to emphysema and lung problems. They learned that you had to filter this and clean it up because the men were breathing this in and dying. Next. Along with the roller mill technology, as much flour that you produced, you needed to sift it, and that's an advancement in the sifting processes. You had some huge advances in the size of mills, not necessarily because of the milling process, but the sifting and packaging process that had to be added. The more flour you produce, the more you have to make sure it's handled properly and sifted and bagged, and like I said, it's called gradual reduction milling. It led to a finer, whiter grade of flour. Next. Modern rolling mills. They look like modern machinery. But as of 1942, the government required enrichment of white flour, mainly white bread. They had to replace the vitamins and minerals, and that's what we see today as enrichment. We learned that when you get rid of the bran and the germ, it's void of nutrients, and you had to put something back, and that's what happened as of the government regulations in 1942. Next. We're going to touch on something a little different. Next. Most early mills were known as post mills. That upper structure turned on a post, which allowed the veins, they're called sweeps, but you can call them arms, whatever, to face the wind. You had almost no control over there was no control over the winds. You had to control the direction of the mill. So you turned the mill to face the wind. And of course, a lot of them were called polder mills. Polder is lowland. And a lot of these mills were water pumps. They weren't grist mills. Some of them were, most of them weren't, because in the Netherlands you were gaining lowland by pumping out the water. And that these windmills are probably still in action today, but maybe there are a lot more technology advances there as far as electricity goes. But that's what you look at with a post mill. Next. An advancement would be the tower mill. You build a tall structure, and only the top, the turret, was moved towards the wind. And you either mechanically or physically have to move that turret. Now, if you're looking at a highland here, that the higher the mill to gain the wind, you had to raise the structure. So you could not gain access to the sails. You needed a balcony to do that. You had to physically unfurl the sailcloths onto the sweeps to catch the wind. You can see your example. And here's a history lesson from Holland. Holland, Michigan. Well, of course, it's named after Holland in the Netherlands. This mill was built in 1761. In 1965, they brought it to Holland, Michigan. Disassembled, brought here and rebuilt. Of course, Holland, Michigan celebrates this with the tulip festivals and whatever. But in Netherlands, they were up in arms. This created a problem. It's their national heritage. They said, never again will an authentic windmill be taken from the Netherlands and brought anywhere. This stopped it as of 1965. They did not allow any more. It was like taking away the national heritage of Holland and bringing it to America. They said no more. It's not allowed. You can rebuild a replica, but you're not allowed to take an actual Holland, Netherlands mill and take it anywhere. They're supposed to stay over in Europe. This caused problems. It's nice in Michigan, but they did not like the idea in Holland. Geneva, Illinois. This was built in 1855. Moved to a park in 1914. This is your typical Cape Cod windmill. They call them a smock mill because there's certain pleats on the outside of the building resemble a clergy's pleated smock. That's why a lot of them were called smock mills, because of a long flowing clothing that clergy would wear. This is the closest windmill to where we're sitting. It's a recreation. Next. This is in Hunterdon County, New Jersey. Holland Township, built in 1965 by Paul Jorgensen. Unfortunately, it looks like that today. He passed away since. His family does not have the money to do any restoration. It was ruined by a storm in 2007. It's nice that in 2016, 127 acres were placed under a Hunterdon Township land trust. It's preserved, but that doesn't give you the $500,000 or so it's going to take to rebuild that. So it's nice that things are preserved, but it still takes money. And as far as I know, it still looks like that today. The family of Paul Jorgensen, they're watching it fall apart. And chances are they'd have to bring someone from the Netherlands to rebuild it. and it's 7 stories tall. Imagine the size of equipment you need to work on that. It's just mind-boggling. And like I said, hundreds of thousands of dollars is the price tag. And unfortunately, it might not never happen. Next. Here's an up-close view. The sailcloths are out in number 1, which means the mill is operational. Or unless a clutch is thrown and holds it steady. You can bring the sailcloths in to make sure you shut it off. In scene number 2, you can throw a brake on the interior axle, make sure it doesn't move. And on the 3rd scene, you're watching the men do it manually. They've unfurled, and those sails have to be strong enough to crawl up like a ladder. They're not flimsy structures. You have to crawl up them things and unfurl that cloth to make it work. And then you have to pull it along. Now, the next scene might show a bit more technology. I'm not sure. I think I got too far into windmills, and I did. I took away some of the scenes where you'd actually have winches outside to turn the cap of the mill to bring the sailcloths to rotate the mill as you're going along. But we're going to more of Americana here. The Robertson Mill was known in 1723, and it was gone as of 1956, or in ruins as of when they were rebuilding Williamsburg. But they did recreate it for the 350th anniversary of Jamestown. And it was extensively restored 1910 to 1916, and still exists today as a site in Williamsburg. And again, that's a post mill. You can easily see where there's a post built up from the bottom, going up through the mill, and the entire structure will turn, not just a tower. Next. We'll touch on tide mills quickly, because that's about all I have as far as tide mill goes. Along the shore, you had to control a tide if you wanted water power. The upper scene, the tide's coming in. Once it comes in, you have to throw a gate closed and enclose the pond. You couldn't use the mill because you had high water inside and outside. You had to wait for the tide to go out. And then you could open the gate and run the mill just like a land mill next to a dam on a stream. But you only had a few hours for that water to be used. You had to use it efficiently and try to make it last, because you would not see that for another 12 hours approximately. Because as soon as you used your water, you had low tide. You had to wait for the high tide to come in. So again, you're looking at a 12-hour process, but it's only used about 3 to 4 hours, because that's your usage of water. There were many tide mills, approximately 300 on the East Coast, many around Long Island, New England, the Chesapeake Bay. I believe it still has some as a historic site, but they're not operational. Imagine the floods through the years, and the salt water primarily deteriorates things. There is known to be about 12 remaining, and none are functional, as far as I know, through Spoon Records. Next. Mill bridges. As you might have heard me say, there's a marriage in places between other Americana, and here we have the connection between mills and covered bridges. If you were on the wrong side of the stream, you couldn't get your grain to the mill. So there had to be some kind of a compromise, and either the community would build a bridge, the miller, or whatever. So a lot of times there was a lottery, and they'd bring in funds from the community and make sure there's funding for the bridge. But an example is Lancaster County. I believe there's about 30 or so covered bridges. Ray might know for sure. But I believe over 20 of them are named for mills. They're called something mill, Johnson's Mill, Bridge, whatever. They're very well known. A lot of places, the grist mills are named after a mill. None around here, I don't believe, in Lehigh County. Well, there are, but either the mill is gone, or technology or progress led to other things. Next. Okay, Now remember I mentioned something about gristmills, not known for being something that grinds grain. Now here we're going to go on to a little bit of entertainment, commemorating mills, but not for grinding grain. Next. Who can answer this?
Orson Welles.
Next.
Yeah.
What did he do? He created a nationwide scare. And it all had to do with some place in New Jersey.
Grover's
Next.
Mills.
Now what you're looking at is celebrated as Grover's Mill in Grover's Mill, New Jersey. But what you're looking at is a barn. A lot of people will look at that. Now today that's been completely restructured. It's used in alternate uses. I believe there's a chiropractor or a dentist office there. It looks the same. It's been completely rebuilt. But across the street is, next scene, is Grover's Mill. People see that name, Grover's Mill, oh, look at the old mill, but they don't turn around and look at the old mill. Apparently, we have some history going back to 1764. This structure was built in 1855. It was successful. Otherwise, they wouldn't expand it on. When you see an expansion of a mill, it was successful. It closed in 1947. It was pretty much forgotten, except from Orson Welles' scare to the nation. But this is what it looks like today. The town decided, well, we don't know what to do with it. So they kept it, and they turned it into a community center. You can tell by the outline of the building pretty much what used to be. They kept it, revised it. It's probably completely rebuilt. They saved the overall shape, and it is a community center today in Grover's Mill, Mercer County, New Jersey. Next. Anybody ever seen these books? The thing is, when you read a book, you want to be surprised at the end. Well, they've revealed the secret right on the cover. You know, the kid found a Christmas puss, railroad to play with in the mill. So it kind of ruins the secret. But how many people know the secret that the Hardy Boys found? What was in there? Counterfeiters were producing $20 bills in the basement. And it was a race for the Hardy Boys to get to the police before the counterfeiters captured them and held them captive in the mill. It was a adventure for the Hardy Boys, and that's the story. Hidden in the book. Counterfeiters producing $20 bills. Next, I think that book dates to about 1928. Postcards, which I'm very well familiar with. There was an era when a postcard would be looked at as the #1 communication in the nation. There was an era where a lot of people did not have a car. They did not have a phone. They did not have a radio. They had the post office. The post office would allow you to deliver a postcard with a penny. But there were times where they would charge 2 cents if you'd have an envelope, especially in wartime. World War I, they expanded the postage rate to 2 cents in wartime era. But a postcard was a way to communicate. And they used Americana and all sorts of scenes in the holidays to do that. And I have a collection of hundreds of scenes similar to this. And it was fascinating to me to discover it, and I think it's incredibly beautiful. But the fact is, in this era of 1905, I'm going to go into a postcard spiel. These are German produced, because Germany had superior printing presses. And it went away in World War I because they were blown up. And Germany was bad and was punished for it. And that went away from these beautiful scenes of, they continue, postcards certainly continue, but the German look and the superior colors and printing went away. And of course, postcards developed into other forms of real photos and such, but this era of the printing is spectacular. Next. Oh, okay, we'll look at some more. Again, I congregated to the mills. You see a water wheel on almost every image that I've found. Well, I've looked for them. and I've singled them out. And here I am showing them to you. Next. Now we're going to go on to more Americana. I found out, I didn't show you my t-shirt. It actually has this mill on it. And the Mabry Mill is one of the more celebrated mills in America. But it was built around 1905. It isn't an ancient mill. Edwin Mabry built it and had it available for the community. He passed away in 1936, and his wife sold the property to the National Park Service because they were looking to bring the Blue Ridge Parkway through southern Virginia. And all up and down the coast there through the Carolinas. As of 1938, it was sold, and it took from 1936 to 83 to get all the land rights secured. Some people just did not want to sell. And here in southern Virginia, it's milepost number 176. Now you can imagine, prior to this roadway, there was a mill pond. You'll see other pictures. There was a mill pond here. It's dried up, but this was very much a disruption. And the waterway goes underneath. And next scene. This is what it looks like today. This is a borrowed from the internet. Very celebrated Mabry Mill. Next. And I'll continue. I have about 45 different scenes of this mill. And I looked for a quotation to talk about trees, and even George Nakashima might be a Japanese immigrant, but he's from Bucks County. We celebrate him on Antiques Roadshow and wherever, but it leads to what I want to talk about: trees. If you find old scenes and you want to know which one's the oldest, you look for the low trees. As the trees grow, so does time. And so you've got an older scene, and look how the trees grew up. And even though this scene might have been 1960s or so, you're looking at maybe the late 30s when the park developed the roadway, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s maybe. But you look at the trees to look at how the landscape grows. Next. We're looking at Plymouth, Massachusetts, the John Jenny Mill. It was originally there in 1636. It burnt down. It was rebuilt in 1683. As of 1840, it burnt down again. From 1840 to 1970, there was a celebrated hole in the ground that was called the site of the John Jenny Mill. They rebuilt it in 1970, approximately. It's certainly cemented in the culture there in Plymouth, Massachusetts. In 1913, it was incorporated into the property of the Plymouth Plantation. So it's very secure. Whether or not it ever looked like that, nobody knows. But they rebuilt a mill. We're grateful for that. But it has become a tourist attraction. And you can see the expansion that went on from 1970 to today. And they had to get some of that machinery from somewhere. And some of it came from Pennsylvania back in 1970, approximately. Next. Some of that machinery came from Scioto, Pennsylvania. Back in the 1960s, the current owner at that time sold the inner contents of the mill to help the Plymouth Plantation. And that mill up in Massachusetts has some Pennsylvania equipment in it, even today. As of 1974, that owner, the next owner, Carl Hope, said, well, we can't let this go. He's going to donate the property to Hamilton Township, Monroe County, and he certainly did, to be preserved for historical and educational purposes, and it is today. As of 2008, they had reacquired mill equipment and put it back. And it was operational as of 2008. In fact, I was there a month ago, sitting there helping them celebrate. In 2008, unfortunately, after they got done celebrating their opening, the inner wall fell down. Because you're looking at old lime mortar and such, and there was only so much you can do to recreate something without modernizing. So they poured concrete, and this is underground. They weren't going to rebuild a stone wall. They poured concrete, fixed it, and ever since then, it has been somewhat operational. Currently, they need a new water wheel, and the price tag is about $50,000. That includes getting the old one out, getting a new one in. They're looking at a local VOTEC for a project up there in Monroe County to possibly help out with doing that. So, next. Again, we're looking at an old mill in Westmoreland County, Virginia. It was part of the Lee family. Thomas Lee owned it, the property, in 1718. It was known with a mill, his neighbors were known as the Popes. That just happens to be their last name, Pope, in 1721. Thomas Lee created Stratford Hall, which is the Lee family house, home, mansion. Thomas Lee created a new mill in 1740. A new mill came along in 1860. Combination gristmill sawmill, known in history. 1905 the dam broke and the mill was abandoned. Well, this is the family of Robert E. Lee, who of course is celebrated in Virginia. And they established a need for a Robert E. Lee memorial at Stratford Hall. Well, I said, oh, well, there used to be a mill here. Well, where was it? Well, it's out in the woods there. It was so overgrown after 30 or so years, there wasn't even a road to find it. They had to excavate to get to the foundation, and then they didn't know what to do with it. So they created a new mill in 1939, and it still exists today, but they didn't know what it should look like. So they borrowed a scene from Americana to produce this. Next scene. They looked at Currier and Ives, Winter in the Country. Now you turn that sideways, reposition the water wheel, you're looking at what they used as inspiration to create the Lee grist mill down in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Next. George Washington had a hand in this mill. He owned property either as his own family or Martha's family, who was just as prosperous before they were married. He was known as surveying, and he surveyed a lot of property out Pennsylvania to Ohio, and this is Fayette County, Pennsylvania. These are scenes from about 1910 or so. As of 1918, the mill was in ruins and falling down, and it was virtually abandoned in 1926. They wanted to rebuild something in 1932 to honor George Washington's 200th birthday. It didn't happen. At that time, the #1 millwright in the nation was named John Campbell. He was from Philadelphia. He was helping build a new mill in Massachusetts. It wasn't available. It was forgotten about. 1976 comes along, the bicentennial. We want to celebrate America. It didn't get rebuilt then either. So now we're coming into the 1980s, and it's just a hole in the ground. There's some stones laying around. They secured the property, bought what they had to, and as of 1992, they began rebuilding the George Washington grist mill. And as of 1999, it was complete. Next. Old scene, new scene. It was completely rebuilt, and that's a scene I borrowed from millpictures.com. Robert Kingsley was the photographer, still known as the photographer millpictures.com, and he might even have a hand in covered bridges at times too. He likes taking Americana photos. So here you have your historic grist mill, built in 1999, dedicated to George Washington. Next. We have another George Washington mill. This one's down there, of course, about Mount Vernon. His father had a mill near Mount Vernon, but by the time George took it over, it was not operational, so he tore it away and rebuilt what looked like the mill in the upper left. It was operational after George died. Martha's grandson, or granddaughter's husband, keep in mind, George and Martha did not have any children. Martha had 3 children or so before she was a widow that George helped raise. So you have Martha's granddaughter husband ran the mill into the 1840s approximately, and it was in disrepair, and they tore it away in 1850. So here you're looking at a big hole in the ground as of 1932, when George Washington's birthday comes around for the 200th time, and they rebuilt it around 1932, and that's what you, well, same scene, but different color to the right there. And it was given to Mount Vernon by Virginia in 1997. It's still open today. That's constantly being rebuilt because apparently they built it originally in 1932 quickly, and a lot of millers say, well, it shouldn't be like the way, it shouldn't be this way. And so there is a more, there was an effort to really give it an authentic look as it would look like in 1771. And that's what you get to see today if you tour that mill. Next. Here we have adaptive reuse. What do you do with an old mill when no one wants it? It was part of a furnace in Oxford, New Jersey. It became a plumbing supply business in 1910. A church come along and wanted the property in 1915. And the bottom scene, I borrowed from Google. I just happened to drive down the street on the computer, and that's a saved photo right off a computer. I was there years past, but in 1917 I kept that scene off the Google map, and that's what you see there today. Adaptive reuse. Don't tear it away. Make use of it. And we're glad they did. Oxford, New Jersey. Next. This is a mill that's seen in pictures and postcards and calendars. It's the Glade Creek Mill in Cliff Top, West Virginia. Built in 1976. It sure looks a lot older. They used parts and pieces from 3 other mills in West Virginia, but they did dedicate it to what they knew as 500 mills that once existed in West Virginia that went by the wayside, and this is available to tour. I took that picture in 1995 to the left, and that's a postcard scene. And you can walk, the stream isn't very high at low water, so you can walk down over the boulders and things. It's a very, very scenic area, very beautiful. And I took a nice long distance view of that mill from down below, and I thought I had everybody out of it. No one's standing by a window, and I snapped this picture, and I had made it into an 8x10. Sure enough, there was a little boy standing in the middle of the creek, bending over with his butt sticking at me. But, oh well. But I didn't know it until I blew up the picture, and there's a little boy in the stream. But I got my picture of the mill, and many more. So, West Virginia, next. And here we come to the Wayside Inn property. In 1923, Henry Ford bought this property. This mill wasn't there at the time. Now remember I mentioned a man named Campbell. He was busy helping Henry Ford build this around 1926 to 29, and there was nothing there at the time. So you have certainly an authentic looking old mill being created in 1929 by the hand and funding of Henry Ford. Pepperidge Farm was fledgling business. They used this mill from 1951 to 67 to grind their flour. But we all know Pepperidge Farm grew, and they outgrew this mill. And they are probably very modern and industrious. The way they do things today certainly is modern. So this mill spurred ideas in me. I can remember seeing this mill in postcards and jigsaw puzzles, for main thing. I can remember almost arguing with my sister that wasn't a part of the mill, it was something else. Well, when we had it together, it's a bridge. So I remembered this. So years later, Jay, next. Hey, right through the wall, through the window, that's good. Now what does an Oldsmobile have to do with an old mill? There was a time where I would collect anything automotive, auto racing, whatever. And these are postcards. Well, the top one is from my collection. I found the other one a little bit later. But Jay, next scene. This was in my collection of automotive. And I remembered the earlier scenes, and in the early 90s, I said to I have to find this. And I have to find, this was the first mill out of this area that I had to go visit. And this is about 20 miles west of Boston, in Sudbury, Massachusetts. And I was into trivia, and if you've read what's there already, it's incredible that the advertising department at General Motors in Oldsmobile likely did not know they're using scenery that was created and owned by Henry Ford. It's just, it's the same scene, but the gold car, it looks to be, you're looking at a 1984 postcard. I don't know if we had much computerized imagery to change that car from gold to silver, or there had to be some kind of manipulation in the photograph originally to create that. But not only you're looking at some trivia, in my mind, automotive bringing me into a gristmill situation, but yeah, Oldsmobile kind of laid an egg there, and I didn't know it right away until I really studied it, and then I waited, just take a look at this, and that really spurred me on to what I know and what I'm showing you today. That scene with the Oldsmobile. That's what began it all for me. Next. And if you're further interested, we have a Society for the Preservation of Old Mills. I have some publications out there to look at. I've been a member since, as I said, 1994 approximately. They are actually a member of TIMS, the International Molinological Society, which is worldwide. And I did mention there is a millpictures.com. Jim Miller was from Bucks County. He moved to Oregon. I don't know why. And him and most of the photography today you'll find is by Bob Kinsey. And those are main sources, very prominent sources of the documentation and what you see online today, which that's the way we're going. Next. And this is my final scene, going back to postcards. And look, I fixed that today. That thank you was hanging down at the bottom, and I manipulated it and put it back into place. So that sets it off. And that's the end of my presentation. Any questions?
It's 3:30, we've got another half hour.
3:30, I went now. Wow.
We'll stay as long as we have to.
Yeah, okay.
Ask you
I have a
questions.
little display on the table out there, and if we have some scenes of local, if you want to plug them in, Ed, if
Does
it'll work.
everybody want to take the time to see the local?
We have some local scenes from their historical archives.
Okay.
All right, I have to shut these.